Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Outlandish Talmud Stories, Outstanding Life Lessons, class 34. Tonight's class is titled, A 5-Star Seder in Bnei-Brak. We are now just a few weeks away from Pesach, so it's time to start to pour through some of the outlandish Pesach stories in the Talmud and try to use them to illuminate our Pesach, our Seder, such a special festival that's coming our way very soon. I want to thank tonight's sponsors. Thank you to Laynie Stern for dedicating tonight's class in honor and commemoration of the yahrtzeit of her father, Rabbi Avraham ben Zvi HaKohen Z, a tremendous person, a man of chesed, of kindness, of tzedakah, of so many valuable traits, and may his neshama have an aliyah and be a blessing for the Stern family and for Klal Yisrael, for everybody. I also want to thank Rona Trachtenberg, who's made a dedication for tonight's class, and she's honoring her Bet David Hadelnik Shul family and friends with wishes for good health, happiness, harmony, sanity, serenity, peace, prosperity, an end to all your problems, and love for one another. So thank you, Rona, and may God bless you and your family with only good things. If you want to dedicate a class, Ilana, the granddaughter, is here. Yep, he'll be very proud of you. And all his grandchildren. If you want to dedicate a class, there's a link in the video description. You can click on that and help support our work. There's also the link to the source sheet for tonight in the video description. So click on that, download the source sheet. We will be studying from there. So I want to begin with a story. It happened Erev Pesach, the day before Pesach, in Jerusalem, in the old city, maybe about 90 years ago. There was a very great rabbi with a grayish beard, thick rimmed glasses, surrounded by his students, walking away from the kotel, having prayed, and now going back to his home to prepare for that night's Seder. His name was the great Rabbi Avraham Zvi HaKohen Kook, Rav Kook, who was at that time the chief rabbi of Palestine, as it was known. He was the founder of a very popular, famous yeshiva, Merkaz Harav. He was the leader of many Jewish people, and he was an ardent, very strong Zionist. And besides being a great Talmudist and halachist, he was also a great philosopher. And in his writings, his very deep philosophical writings, he wrote about the flourishing, about the coming of Mashiach and the coming of redemption as he sees it, as Israel, people are starting to move there and settlements are starting to rebuild over there. And he even finds redemptive qualities in the very secular Zionist movement, seeing that it too is, in a way, bringing about the promises of all the prophets. Now, as he's walking on the street surrounded by his students, on the other side, far away, is another very great rabbi, a long white beard, a sort of gold-striped kapata, sirtok coat, surrounded by his students also. He was none other than the great Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Rav Sonnenfeld was also a very prominent rabbi in Jerusalem at the time, and more from what we would call perhaps the ultra-Orthodox camp. And he was the leader of the Yishuv Hayashan, the old settlement, the Jewish neighborhoods inside the old city at the time, and some of the neighborhoods that were growing outside of the old city. A lot of his followers were from Hungarian Jewry, and he founded the Eidah Haredit, sort of the very ultra-Orthodox branch, umbrella administrative organization in Israel. And they came from a much more hard right-wing school of thought, very anti-Zionist or secular Zionism. And so you couldn't have two greater opponents, ideological, philosophical opponents, than Rav Sonnenfeld and Rav Kook. And now the students are looking out because the two are about to cross paths with each other on this day, Erev Pesach, in Jerusalem, in the old city, about 90 years ago. There was a lot of tension in the air. What's one going to say to the other? Well, as they passed each other, Rav Sonnenfeld turns to Rav Kook and he greets him and he says, sollst solche sein Leben über ein Jahr zu gehen barfis in Blut. You should merit to, in the year to come, to experience walking barefoot in blood. Now, the students of Rav Kook were alarmed. They thought he's giving this eternal curse to their Rebbe, to their great rabbi, to walk barefoot in blood. But Rav Kook gave a smile and he answered, Amen. And he walked on. And the students were alarmed. He just cursed you out. And you're responding, Amen, with a smile. So he explained to them, my dear students, you don't understand. He was giving me a blessing. He's referring to the passage in the Talmud in Psachim that describes on the Erev Pesach, the day before Pesach, when thousands of Jewish people from all over the country will come to the temple to Jerusalem. And they had to offer the Pesach offering, the Pesach sacrifice. And there were thousands of lambs being slaughtered in the temple. And so the Talmud describes there was so many slaughters, so many offerings that the Kohanim, the priests who were worshiping in the temple, who would go barefoot, but the slaughterhouse there was packed with so many sacrifices that there was a thick layer of blood all over the floor, blood and guts and many other things. And the Kohanim were walking barefoot in the blood. And he was wishing Rav Kook, who was a Kohen, next year, may you be the one in our temple when Mashiach will come, and you'll be walking around barefoot in the blood as well. It's a beautiful story. And I think that leads into the theme, or one of the themes that I want to share tonight. Tonight, we're going to study and talk about what I think could be proclaimed as the most famous Pesach Seder in world history. And the reason why it's the most famous Pesach Seder in world history is simply because up until today, Jewish people every single year at their Seder talk about this story. So it's been spoken about by all the Jewish people, and lots of Jewish people celebrate Pesach for close to 2,000 years. The setting is in the late 1st century or early 2nd century after the Common Era. We're talking about the transition time after the destruction of the temple, when the Romans destroyed the temple. And there was a lot of tension, a lot of persecution. The Romans were taking control over the Jewish people. There were plans of a revolt. We've talked about this before. The great general, the great leader Bar Kokhba, who was a fierce warrior, and he was building an army to revolt against the Romans, which he did. It didn't work out, though. And a lot of the rabbis, a lot of the Jewish people did not support him or the army or the efforts. Others did support. One of the great supporters, as you may recall, is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was the Rebbe, the leader, the supporter, the advisor of Bar Kokhba. And so in this generation, that's a transitional generation to post the temple. And now they're trying to adapt Judaism into a world without a temple. And one of the strangest times is Pesach, because Pesach used to be all about visiting the temple. Like the 3 major holidays, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, all Jews came to the temple and celebrated there. And now there was no temple. And now there's no Pesach offering. And now we have to figure out, how do we celebrate Pesach in our homes, with our families, in our communities, without the Korban Pesach? The whole Seder looks different. Everything about Judaism looks different without the temple. And so this generation, there's many great rabbis, many of whom were spoken about in this series, who we attribute our Judaism today, our rabbinic Judaism, and the practice of Judaism without a temple to their efforts, to their leadership, to their wisdom, to their foresight, to be able to guide us into how to experience many of these things. Now, they were very different, all of them. And very often they did not see eye to eye on many things. And if you study the Talmud, we have many disputes, many debates among them. But that's the beauty. And they didn't agree with each other, but there's a halakha, there's a law, there's the way we eventually follow, which is culminated, which is brought together by it's enriched by the opinions and the teachings of these great sages. So, let's study the story together about this Seder. And there is so much we can learn. Sometimes we read this text, we read it in the Haggadah, in the night of the Pesach, and sometimes we just read through it, and maybe we say a few nice things about it, but I'm not sure if we realize the great depth that it can offer us today, nearly 2,000 years ago, in our Seder. So, in your source sheet, let's go to text number 1. It's a passage from the Haggadah. This story that we're about to study together, very interestingly, is not recorded anywhere in the Talmud, surprisingly. It's not recorded anywhere in the Midrash, or the Tosefta, or the Braitot, or any other of those early works. It's not recorded anywhere. At some point, it appears in one of the first texts of the Haggadah that was prepared to recite as the text for the Seder. So this is what we have, and it's universal today, and we're going to read the story together. I'm sure the story will be familiar to you, but I hope you'll learn something new tonight. Here's how the story goes. It happened once. Now, I'm going to omit the next two words that are in brackets because they're not in the original text. That's in someone's English translation. It happened once that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, 5 great rabbis, which you've probably heard about them before because we've spoken about them before. They were reclining in Bnei-Brak and were telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt that whole night until the students came and said to them, in the morning, at dawn, the students came and they said, the time of reciting the morning Shema has arrived. Time to stop your study, time to stop your discussions. We got to get up, we got to go to the synagogue. We have to pray, we have to recite the Shema. That's the story. So who are these rabbis? Let's just a brief overview about who these rabbis were. Again, this is first generation Tanaim or second generation, most of them students of the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the great leader at the time of the destruction of the temple. We've learned about him before. And so we have one of the rabbis is Rabbi Eliezer. He settled in the city of Lud. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, the son of Hyrcanus, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai praised about him. He was one of his favorite students, and he said he's bor sud she'eno ma'abed tipa. He's like a pit, a cistern that is cemented that never loses a drop. Any piece of information that enters into this person's head, he never forgets. He knows the entire Torah. He's got an unbelievable memory. Rabbi Eliezer was a very strong person, strong-willed, strong-minded person. There are many stories in the Talmud where people butted heads with him, but he did not give up. And he was very firm, and he stood up for what he believed to be true. In the end, he ran into some problems because he ended up being excommunicated, sadly, by his colleagues because he didn't play along with certain things. And in fact, he dies a bit of a lonely and tragic death at the end of the day. Not a story that we're going to study right now. Then we have Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua, another one of the favorite students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He settles in the city of Peki'in. Peki'in is not too far from Lud. And also a very great sage. Then we have Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He was a bit younger than the others. And we read about him in the Haggadah a bit later. And we've read a story about him once that when Rabbi Gamliel, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, the head of the court in Yavna, he was eventually deposed because he mistreated Rabbi Yehoshua, who we just mentioned. So they appointed Rabbi ben Azariah. He was only 18 years old, apparently. So his wife said, you're too young. So he grew white hair overnight. Maybe you probably know the story. So that's the next rabbi. Then we have Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, who we know. We've studied about him many, many times, and he's going to feature prominently in tonight's class, and he features prominently everywhere. Wherever you go, the whole Talmud is prominent. In the night of the Seder, the Pesach, the text of the Haggadah, he's very prominent also. And he is the fourth rabbi. And finally, Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon was already one of the older ones. In fact, it is told that he possibly already worshipped in the temple many decades ago. So for him, imagine, he was in the temple during the times of glory, and then the temple was destroyed. And for him now celebrating Pesach and sitting at a Seder, not in Jerusalem, without the Korban Pesach, was probably a very difficult experience for him. So these are 5 rabbis who live in complete different places. They each are head of different yeshivot in Lud, in Yavne, in Peki'in, in all different kinds of places. But now the story goes that they're all coming together to have a Seder in Bnei-Brak. Now, the Bnei-Brak mentioned here may or may not be the identical Bnei-Brak that we call today Bnei-Brak. Some scholars say that this is actually a location a little bit outside of Bnei-Brak, and actually somebody mentioned to me today that there is somewhere, maybe you know more about this, where they've identified outside of the city a possible location for this story to have happened, but I didn't get a chance to look into that. Bnei-Brak was where Rabbi Akiva lived. So it seems like they're all coming to Rabbi Akiva's house to have this Seder. And a whole night they're recounting the story of Exodus. As we know, that's the mitzvah, and that is the great opportunity, the night of Pesach, to talk about Exodus. As we say in the Haggadah, Kol hamarbeh lesaper b'tiz Mitzrayim, whoever increases to talk about the Exodus at great length, harei zeh meshubach, that is very praiseworthy. That is the mission of the night. Not to talk about Lashon Hara, and not to talk about what happened with the neighbors and in Shul and some. No, talk about focused theme of the evening, the Exodus. And in the morning, they went a whole night. And in the morning, the students come and remind them to recite the Shema. You know, there's a mitzvah to say the Shema twice, once in the morning and once at nighttime. So they were reminded about reciting the Shema. Now, first of all, like I mentioned, this is a very interesting, I want to do a few analysis of the story before I get into some deep, powerful, strong questions that we have over here. As I mentioned, the story is not mentioned in the Talmud or in the Midrash or anywhere. It first appears in the Haggadah, which is interesting. There is, however, a similar story that is mentioned in the Talmud. And the story goes, I'm reading it over here, that Rabbi Gamliel, he wasn't one of the five in our story, but he was the head of the Sanhedrin in Yavne. So Rabbi Gamliel and the elders were once reclining in the house of Baitus, the son of Zunin, in Lud. And they were involved with the laws of Pesach the whole night until the call of the rooster. Then the students raised the blinds, they saw the sun, and they all went to the house of study and prayer to daven and to say the Shema. It's a similar story. There is a difference, which many commentaries point out, and I'm not going to get into a great length, but if you notice in that story that I just read, it says that Rabbi Gamliel and the elders were studying the laws of Pesach the whole night. In our story, it says these five sages were recounting the story of Exodus the whole night. What is the purpose of the night of the Seder? How should the discussions look like? Should they be legal discussions about Pesach, about the Pesach offering, studying the Talmud? Or should they be historical discussions about Exodus, about the ideas of exile and freedom? And this is a big debate about the nature of the kinds of conversations we should be having and where we should be applying our efforts and how we should be educating the children to study more the laws or recount the history. In the end, it's a bit of both. I mean, doing one or the other, you're going to be safe. But doing a bit of both on the night of Pesach is definitely a good thing. Now, let's just analyze something else for a moment, because everything is very particular in the Talmud. And if we analyze the order of the names, the way they're listed. Now, you know, when you're having in royalty or in government or in any kinds of formal settings, and you're listing a list of names of people who are involved with something or attending something, the order is very important. We put a lot of effort. I mean, unless you're going to be safe and do alphabetical order, then you're safe, of course. But if you choose not to do alphabetical order, you need to have a good reason why someone's mentioned first, and second, and why somebody's mentioned last. Here, the order is very strange. It's not in alphabetical order. Eliezer, Yehoshua, Elazar, Akiva, Tarfon. It's not in age order. What kind of order is this? And if you think about it, actually, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, they were teachers of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Tarfon was perhaps a teacher, but later he was a colleague of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, he was the Nasi, he was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time. So how are these names listed over here? So there's one beautiful commentary. There's a number of commentaries. I'm going to share with you one. And that is a commentary offered by the Lubavitcher Rebbe in his notes on the Haggadah. One of the very first, I think the first work that the Rebbe authored in the 1940s, before he became the Rebbe, was a commentary on the Haggadah. It's a very deep commentary. It's very terse. It's very brief. It's not pages and pages. It's a lot of references, see here, see there, and it's also a gathering of many other sources that at the time were not very popular. So it's a very profound work to study. So there the Rebbe quotes a source who explains like this. We know, the Talmud talks about that the way seating arrangements were arranged in the time were the head person or the most prominent person sat in the middle at the head of the table. And then the next prominent person after him sat sort of a little bit above and behind, perhaps a little bit to the right of that person. And then the next, as he went down the list, sat more to the left at the front. And that was the order, the seating arrangement, traditionally in the times of the Talmud. So if you look at the list over here, the middle name is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He is the Nasi. He's the head, the president of the Sanhedrin. So he's in the middle. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, I mentioned before him because that was their seating arrangement. They were sitting a little bit behind him to his right because they were second to him. And then Rabbi Tarfon, who was more of a junior, and Rabbi Akiva as well, who was a student, are sitting more below the head of Rabbi Elazar and more to the left. So the order they're being listed in is probably the order they were seating. If you were to walk in the room and describe it, you would see them sitting in this order. That's not the order of their prominence, but it's a result of the order of their prominence. Okay, now let's think about why is this story in the Haggadah? This features in the section called Magit. So we've already made Kiddush, we've washed our hands, we've eaten the karpas, the bitter vegetable in the salt water, and then we begin the Magit. The Magit is the section that we recount the story of Exodus. It's typically a long time. It's a long text. At least read as much as you can, or at least enjoy and immerse yourself for the time that you have in, and including the children, of course, in the story of the Exodus. And pretty much after we begin, we ask the 4 questions, the Manishtana, which leads us into the Magid, and then this story appears. The simple explanation why the story appears is because we just said in the introduction that it's a big mitzvah to recount the story of the Exodus. The more, the merrier. And we said, afilu, even if you're a chacham, if you're a navon, if you're a wise person, if you're a scholar, you're a learned person, and you may argue, or you may think, I don't have to talk about it, I have nothing to learn, I know all about it, I spent my whole year talking about it. Nonetheless, you too have a mitzvah that night to talk about the whole story. And then this story appears, probably to support that idea. These rabbis were the greatest rabbis of the time. There was no greater chacham than them. And they still spent the whole night immersed in recounting the story. That tells us that this is a mitzvah for everybody, whether you're a child, you're ignorant, you're not learned, or you're very learned and you're a senior, it does not matter. In fact, there's something even deeper over here. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Tarfon, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, they happened to be Kohanim. They were Kohens, they were priests. Rabbi Yeshua was a Levite, was a Levi. Rabbi Akiva descended from converts. Why am I telling you this? Think about this. In the slavery in Egypt, we know that all the Jewish people were enslaved by Pharaoh and the Egyptians except for one tribe, the tribe of Levi. There were 12 tribes, which were descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob. The descendants of Levi were not enslaved for whatever reason, which is why by then Moses and Aaron, who are busy running back and forth to Pharaoh's palace and to God, and they're running around. The simple question is, well, how do they have that time and the liberty to run around? They should have been working, and they were slaves. No, they were from the tribe of Levi. Moses being the Levi, Aaron being the Kohen, they were not enslaved. So if you think about it, the 5 people at this Seder were either a Kohen or a Levi or a descendant of converts, which means their ancestors were not in Egypt either. All these 5 people, their ancestors did not experience the slavery. And yet, they still spend the whole night recounting the Exodus. It's very powerful. Sometimes someone may feel, it doesn't feel personal to me. It doesn't feel like it's my story. I'm not feeling a connection. So first of all, you should feel a connection. You've got to figure out, to realize those are the seeds of your people. That's the beginning of your story. You were a slave in Egypt, and you were redeemed from there. And the fact that you're here tonight you have to give enormous gratitude for that. But even if you cannot reach that and you're feeling a little bit detached and disconnected, think about these 5 people. None of their ancestors were involved in the slavery, and they still spent the whole night recounting the Exodus. All right. Now let's get into the story, and I have a lot of questions. It seems like it's a simple story, but it's not. Let's go through some questions over here. First of all, it's very common for students to visit their rabbi for Pesach. If you're not with your family, you go to your rabbi. And it's very common. You want to see how your rabbi conducts themselves during Pesach and the Seder. You want to hear the teachings, the Torah from the rabbi. That's common. It's weird or strange or peculiar if a rabbi, if the Rebbe, the teacher, the master, is visiting the students home for Pesach. That shouldn't be. And yet, we mentioned earlier that Rabbi Akiva was a student of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Why then are they visiting their students home for Pesach? If Rabbi Akiva wants to spend Pesach with them, he should visit them. Either go to Lud, go to Peking, go to somewhere where they are. Why are you bringing your own master to you? Question number one. Question number two. Rabbi Eliezer happens to have an opinion about the festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, all the festivals. And he says that a person should always be spending the festivals with their home, in their home, with their family. It's not the right time to travel and to be out of town. The festivals are family time. And you make an effort to be with your family, to educate them, to celebrate together with them. That was Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And yet, here we see on this Pesach, he left his home, he left his family, he left Lud, and he went to Bnei-Brak to have the Seder together with Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues. Why is he leaving his house? Isn't he the author of the opinion that a person is supposed to remain in their homes during the festival? That's the next question. Another question. There is an argument about how long should the Seder go for? You know, every morning, especially by the children, but you come to Shul Pesach morning, and what's the first question on everyone's mind? How long did your Seder go for? What time did your Seder finish? Ours finished at 12:30. Ours at 1:30. Ours at 2. Ours finished at 10. We were sleeping. But there's actually an argument about how long should the Seder go for. And there's an opinion of, here, two of these rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, two of our rabbis, that the Seder should only go for until midnight. Because the Seder, which means the whole mitzvah of recounting Exodus, is in conjunction with the mitzvah of the night of eating the Korban Pesach, the Pesach offering, together with the maror and the matzah. Their mitzvah had to end by midnight. So therefore, that's the time when you recount the story of Exodus and do all the mitzvot. Once midnight is here, it's over. Now, Rabbi Akiva and others argued, and they thought you can go an entire night. And by the way, nowadays, the first night we're normally more careful to finish everything by midnight. Some people have the custom the second night to be more lax about it, to go past midnight as well. But in any event, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah are of the opinion that you can only go till midnight. After midnight, there's no mitzvah anymore. And yet here we're being told that they sat an entire night, long after midnight, up until dawn, speaking about the Exodus with their colleagues, which is against their own opinion. Next question. Rabbi Tarfon is of the opinion, different than everyone else. We know that we have 4 cups of wine at the Seder. There is a 5th cup of wine, but we don't drink it. That's the 5th cup we pour in for Elijah the prophet. You know, everyone looks to see Elijah drinking a little bit, right? He does. That's what we tell the children. He does on some level, in some realm. But Rabbi Tarfon's of the opinion that actually we drink the 5th cup also. So Rabbi Tarfon has a very different opinion than everyone else. He probably needs to spend Pesach in his own home to be able to exercise his own opinions. Because if he's spending Pesach together with others who disagree with him, in the home of Rabbi Akiva who disagrees with him, he can't get to fulfill his own law, his own opinion. He can't drink the 5th cup. So this whole gathering of these rabbis seems very peculiar, very out of place, very questionable. Why is a master visiting a student? Why are you leaving your home if you're of the opinion you should be in your house? That you have opinions of how to perform the Seder, which you cannot perform once you're visiting someone else's home. Some of the opinion you have to end by midnight. Doesn't make any sense. Why did they choose to do this gathering if it was probably so inconvenient and legally questionable for them also? And then, by the way, there's no mention about their families over here. Were their families with them? Apparently not. Apparently there's just the 5 of them, without their wives, without their children or their grandchildren. And where were they? Why weren't they invited? Why didn't they participate? They were stuck back at home. Strange. And the students, you would imagine if 5 great teachers, scholars, top leaders of a generation are coming together to spend the night in discussion, all the students, each one of their students, which are probably thousands, want to come and be there and get inside the house or stand by the window to hear what they're saying. But it says the students entered the room at dawn to remind them about the Shema, which probably tells us that throughout the whole night they were not present. How come? Wouldn't they want to be there? Your own masters, your own teachers are teaching, and you're just going to sit outside and finish your Seder quickly and then go to sleep or whatever? Where were the students? So, in conclusion, we have a lot of questions over here. There's another question also, by the way. We know that when we drink the 4 cups of wine, when we eat the matzah, certain times during the Seder, you have to lean. We lean to the left. We're showing freedom, redemption. But the law says that if a student is sitting in front of their teacher, a student does not lean. It's disrespectful to exercise such self-expression in the presence of your teacher, your master. Not a school teacher, or maybe also a school teacher, but here we're talking about a Rav Muvak, a teacher that's your teacher for many years and sort of raised you, groomed you, taught you everything you know. So in their presence, you sit with awe and trepidation and respect. You don't let loose and lean. Rabbi Akiva was the student of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Did Rabbi Akiva lean at the Seder? How could he lean? He was there in the presence of his teachers. But if he wants to fulfill the law of leaning, why is he inviting his teachers to come visit him in Bnei-Brak? These are just some of the questions that are raised by the many, many commentaries who have dissected this story. And I'm raising these questions because they're going to lead us. I have a number of answers I want to share with you, but then a final couple answers that I think take this story and turn it into a seminal, crucial cornerstone of the entire Seder experience, and one that we 2,000 years later can learn from tremendously. Okay, what are some answers to these questions? There is one answer. That's a technical answer. That's a nice answer. That says we're making a big mistake over here. We're assuming this story happened on the night of Pesach at the Seder. And therefore we have all of our questions that we raised. But if you look at the original text, and like I told you when we read the story, the brackets that say on Pesach are not from the original Hebrew. It says it happened once that these 5 rabbis were sitting a whole night in Bnei-Brak. It doesn't say it was Pesach. It may have been sometime in the middle of July or any other time of the year. And they came together to study together. And if that's the case, then there's no question about how could they leave their homes for festivals and why would the master travel to the student and all the other questions that we raised. It was a random night of the year they wanted to come and study and resolve a few things together. So that's an interesting technical answer, which, okay, I hear it, I get it. However, it's not so literal. It doesn't seem to be that way. The story clearly talks about that they were mesubin, they were reclining. Maybe they were just gathering, maybe they weren't reclining. Was it Pesach reclining or not? They were talking about the exodus of Yetzias Mitzrayim, exodus from Egypt. A lot of the language in the story seems to clearly suggest that it was Pesach night. And the fact that the Haggadah brings it in the Haggadah, following the command to talk about Exodus the entire night of Pesach, and then it brings this story, it seems clear that whoever put that text in understood, like everyone most understand, is the story happened on Pesach night. And if it happened on Pesach night, then we're back to all of our original questions. How and why did this gathering come together and happen? There's another answer. That's a very creative answer. And it's by a rabbi. His name was Rabbi Reuven Margolis. Reuven Margolis was born in Poland, in Lvov, and later moved to Israel. He passed away, I think, in the 1970s. He lived in Tel Aviv. He was a genius. He had a photographic memory. He knew the entire Torah and all texts, more common ones and much more obscure ones. He had it at his fingertips. And not just that, but he had an unbelievable creativity to his learning. He knew how to weave passages and texts and stories together and create narratives and understand Jewish history in ways that others had never discovered before. He was brilliant. I think he won the Israel Prize for some of his efforts in rabbinic literature. So he gives the following answer. It's more of a historical answer, which is very interesting. He says, in the Talmud elsewhere in Tractate Sukkah, there's a story there, and the story is of Rabbi Gamliel, the head of the Sanhedrin, and Rabbi Akiva, and they once found themselves on a ship on the festival of Sukkot, and they had to scramble together to build a ship on a sukkah on the ship, and the Talmud talks about the legalities of building a sukkah on a ship. That is one story. Another story is brought in the Talmud, not necessarily related to this one, although he links the two. And the other story says that there were Rabbi Gamliel, again, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva were traveling on a boat, and it was the festival of Sukkot, and they did not each have their own lulav and etrog. There was only actually one lulav and etrog, and there was this discussion about how they had to share it with each other and gift it to each other so they can all fulfill the mitzvah on the first day, because you have to own your own lulav and etrog. They didn't own it, so I give it to you as a gift, and then you give it back to me, and I re-gift it to someone else, and that's another discussion. Apparently, says Rabbi Reuven Margolis, these two stories happened at the same time. All of these rabbis that we're talking about over here were on a ship during the festival of Sukkot. And why were they on the ship, and where were they traveling to? So if you know your world history, you know that at that time, at least let's talk about the year 90-something after the Common Era, the Roman emperor's name was Domitian. And Domitian was the son of Vespasian, the emperor during the times of the destruction of the temple. He was a brother of Titus. Titus was the general who took over his father when his father became emperor, and he was in charge of destroying the temple. And after the two of them, the next brother came along, Domitian, and he was the emperor of Rome. He was eventually assassinated. I think it was the year 96 CE. And he was assassinated on September 18th of the year 96. And his successor was the next emperor, whose name was Nerva. And Nerva was already an elderly person, I think in his 50s or 60s, but he wasn't so healthy, he wasn't well. But Nerva, unlike his predecessors, Domitian, Titus, and Vespasian, Nerva was empathetic towards the Jewish people. Very different to them, to the earlier ones. And so it makes sense that as soon, because September time was around Sukkot time, right, the high holiday time, as soon as he became emperor, the rabbis from Jerusalem, from Israel, ran to make a delegation to Rome to visit him. It was very common, by the way, for these rabbis, these leaders to travel to Rome. In the Talmud, there's stories all the time. They're traveling back and forth to Rome for diplomatic missions, for lobbying, and for connections with the emperor and other Roman officials. So possibly they all came together to visit Nerva and to present their case, and the Jewish people support him, and they're expecting support from him back to them. And by the way, they hurried because he wasn't well. And in fact, I think he died a year and a half later. He didn't serve for very long. And he died early in the year 98 after the Common Era. It seems from other places in the Talmud, they were in Rome for about 6 months. And after 6 months, they started to return home. If you do the math, that is approximately the time of Pesach, or a little bit before. He suggests, says Rabbi Margolis, that they were on the ship. It was a very quick trip, unplanned, because they hurried to go meet him, so they didn't have their lulav and etrog, and they had to quickly put together a sukkah. 6 months later, they're returning home. It was before Pesach. They land at the Jaffa port the day before Pesach, perhaps. They didn't even have time to get home. So they say, let's just go to the closest home to spend Pesach. Who was the closest home? Rabbi Akiva. He lived in Bnei-Brak, which is not that far. It was the closest city to Jaffa. And so therefore, all the rabbis followed Rabbi Akiva to his home, not because they planned to go visit the master, to visit the student, or they planned this trip, or they planned to be away from their families, because simply there was not enough time to get to their homes before Pesach started. And so therefore, they spent the Seder night and Pesach in the home of Rabbi Akiva. It's a very creative teaching and understanding of history, weaving together the stories of history and the Talmud. Another answer. As mentioned, Rabbi Akiva supported Bar Kokhba, the great general, in his revolt against the Romans. And he thought that even though the temple has been destroyed, it's not all lost. And perhaps the future of 2,000 years of exile doesn't have to be. And if we fight back hard and strong now, we can push away the Romans outside of Israel and regain sovereignty and rebuild the temple. In fact, Rabbi Akiva suggested that Bar Kokhba could be the Mashiach, the warrior, the leader who's going to bring redemption and salvation to the Jewish people. Now, not everyone agreed with him. Many were very disagreeing in that. However, he thought that way. And so this Seder may have happened at the height during that era, whether right before or during this revolt. This is a very tense time in Israel. There were, among the Jewish communities, there were a lot of opinions of whether yes or no, we to fight, or should we be passive, should we be aggressive, do we even have a chance to win? Maybe we can have better relations with the Romans if we choose not to fight, to be peaceful. This was a diplomatic nightmare in the Jewish community, and there were many different opinions. And now the Seder is happening. Well, the Seder is a good time to come together and discuss the exodus from Egypt, but now the question of the exodus from the Romans. Will we ever regain sovereignty back in Israel, or will we remain slaves and servants in exile to them forever? And so the Seder this night was a crucial meeting, a meeting to discuss the situation. Where should we have this meeting? Well, Rabbi Akiva's home was chosen. Yes, he was a student of some of the teachers. Maybe it shouldn't have been there in terms of Pesach. But he was the Rebbe, he was the spiritual leader of Bar Kokhba. He was the one that had all the influence. He was the one calling the shots in terms of this revolt against the Romans. So we need to go to his home, to his place, to talk to him and to figure this out together and either agree or disagree or advise him. That was the center of that meeting because that's where it needed to take place. That's where those discussions had to be had. Which makes sense, by the way, therefore, why their families were not with them, because this was a very dangerous time. This was during the King Hadrian, Emperor Hadrian's persecutions against the Jewish people, and the Romans felt this revolt from the Jewish people, so they were becoming even more fierce in their persecutions. And it's at this time that we have public executions of Jews, of prominent Jews. We know about the 10 martyrs of great rabbis who were murdered over those years. We read about them on Yom Kippur and on Tisha B'Av. This is a dangerous time to be out of your home, a dangerous time to be traveling, a dangerous time to be celebrating festivals. You remain locked in your home, or if you get caught by the Romans, you could be captured and killed or arrested or taken as a slave back to Rome. And so these rabbis say, we're going to meet secretly, but we're not bringing our wives and our children. It's too dangerous for them. And when they get there, they send their students out of the room. You need to be on watch and on guard. You stand outside, because if you see any movement of any Roman officers or soldiers, run in and tell us, so we're going to stop what we're doing. And that explains why there was no family or students in attendance with them. Gary is making a very good comment, and I'm going to read it soon because I want to get to actually something that you're mentioning. Thank you, Gary. I'll share your comment on the screen in a moment. Then there's another answer that I'm going to share with you before my final answer that I want to share with you. This is also a very important answer. Remember, we're asking, how could it be different rabbis, so many different opinions? You do it till midnight, or you can do it the whole night. 4 cups, 5 cups. I mean, different. Bringing these rabbis into one room could have been a nightmare. They don't agree on anything. They say, it's like a little joke, but if you know history, you know that the Greek emperor Talmai in the Talmud ordered the rabbis. He took 70 rabbis and he put them into different rooms, different cubicles, and he instructed them to translate the Torah from its original Hebrew into Greek, which became the Septuagint, the Greek Bible. And a great miracle actually happened, because when the rabbis were translating the Torah from its original language into Greek, when you translate something, you can't really translate literal, because when you translate literal, often the meaning can be lost or could actually become distorted. And so translation requires a very important skill, whilst on the one hand, to remain truthful to the original language, but also to remain truthful to the content. And so the rabbis had to make a few changes to the language of the Torah in order that it should read in the Greek language properly. For example, the opening words of the Torah. The opening words of the Torah are Bereshit bara Elokim. We translate that as in the beginning of God's creation. He created heaven and earth. But if you read those words literally, Bereshit bara Elokim, Bereshit created God. You could read it like that. It's a false reading, but it could be misleading. And so they didn't want to get Emperor Ptolemy to have a false understanding or distortion of the Bible, so they made some changes. That's one change that they made. Now, each of these 70 rabbis are sitting by themselves. And the great miracle was, says the Talmud, that even though they had to make some changes throughout the whole Torah, each one of them in separate rooms, miraculously with divine spirit, intended the exact identical changes. And so when they came together and had 70 copies of the Greek Bible, they were all exactly the same, with the same changes that they made to keep the original interpretation, the original meaning of the Torah. It was a great miracle. So there's a rabbi who once shared, and he says, it was a joke. That wasn't the biggest miracle. A bigger miracle would have been if the 70 rabbis were in the same room and would have still agreed to produce the one identical text and agreed in every single word and every single letter. If they're in separate rooms, no, nobody's talking to each other. They can do that. But when they're together, no one's going to agree on anything. So that's a joke. But the idea behind it is a true idea. Scholars come together, they have different opinions. So these 5 rabbis coming together, so many different opinions about what the law is and what the practice is. How did the Seder even work out? Was it an organized, cohesive, peaceful Seder? Was the Seder full of friction and argument and tension and quarrels? What happened at this Seder? So I once heard a beautiful teaching, and we can all learn from this. And that is, if you truly want to get together with another person, if you truly want to get together with another family, if that person is a loved one and you want to include them in your life, in your family, no matter how different you are, you'll find a way to make it work. They wanted to spend Pesach together, and they found a way to make it work and to overlook their differences. Think about this nowadays. I get so many questions all the time. This person's coming to my house for the Seder. We're Ashkenaz, they're Sfarad. We're Sfarad, they're Ashkenaz. They come from South America, we come from France, we come from Israel, we were raised in America. We come from Europe, we come from Poland, we're from Hasidim, we're not from Hasidim. We have this custom, they have that custom, we have this text, they have that text. It's going to be a balagan because no one does the same thing and no one has the same custom, and we eat it like this and we don't eat it like this, and we have this vegetable for the karpas or that vegetable for the karpas. We wash our hands by the table, wash our hands in the sink. So many different customs. So on the one hand, all the questions come up. What should we do? What's the best way to conduct the Seder? But you know what the most simple answer that should be given to these questions is? You will figure it out. If you truly want that person to be at your Seder, if you love them, you care about them, their family, their friends, work it out. Understand? You can work it out. If those 5 rabbis, who were the authors of these disagreeing opinions, they worked it out, we can certainly work it out. And by all means, have different cultures, different backgrounds, different customs in your home. And whether people are doing things differently, it's okay also. Whether you all agree to follow the balabais, the host of that evening, it's also okay. We're not talking about actual legal, legal differences that you would cross a line. We're not crossing any lines, talking about customs over here. So, very important lesson. If it's important enough to be with that person, whether it's Pesach or other things also, it doesn't only apply to Pesach. If you're asking the question, it almost sounds like it's not so important to you. Maybe we shouldn't invite them because their customs are too different than ours. Invite them, make it important to you, and work it out. Okay. Now, I want to share a final answer for this evening. And this, I think, gets to the depths and the hearts of the whole story and illuminates the whole Seder night for us. Let's understand what these rabbis were doing together in Bnei-Brak, in Rabbi Akiva's home. And the other piece of the puzzle that we also have not really spoken about is the ending of the story. The students come in and say, Rabbi, Masters, don't forget that the sun has risen. It's time to recite the Shema. Why do they suspect that their teachers forgot? They've never forgotten to recite the Shema a day in their whole lives. Why of this day of all days should they forget? And by the way, even though it's a mitzvah to start to recite the Shema at sunrise, but you really have up until 3 hours into the day to recite the Shema. So if you don't say it now, you can say it in an hour, you can say it in 2 hours. It wasn't the biggest rush to recite the Shema now. What is it? The students are coming in and instructing the rabbis, their teachers, about what to do. So here's the story. Again, let's go back to the context. Let's go back to the scene. We're talking about during the harshest of times in Jewish history, a couple decades after the destruction of the temple, loss of Jewish sovereignty. Millions of Jewish people have been murdered. Millions more taken as captives, as slaves, exiled by the Romans. The Roman emperor is busy butchering, hunting down Jews. Any Jew who's doing a mitzvah, keeping Shabbat, doing a circumcision, arresting them and killing them. Any public performance of Torah study, right? Rabbi Akiva, who studied Torah, put his life in danger. Everyone could be killed for that. Great rabbis were being martyred in public in the stadium in Caesarea. They had the public executions, gruesome, brutal, torturous executions of Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion and Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Terrible, terrible times. This is a time of great difficulty, great challenge, almost a feeling of hopelessness amongst the Jewish people. Is there a future for the Jewish people? Will we ever recover from this? Will we ever regain our own sovereignty? Does Judaism have a future? Doesn't seem like it. It's been totally obliterated and persecuted by the Romans, who are so much stronger than us. And even after the Bar Kokhba revolt, it failed. Bar Kokhba was killed, it was failed. The whole thing went down. And now the Romans became even more emboldened to persecute and to kill the Jewish people. If you look at the literature and the laws about Pesach, you notice something interesting. A lot about Pesach revolves around nighttime mitzvot, nighttime instructions, a nighttime theme, which is interesting because generally a lot of mitzvot are daytime mitzvot. There's very few nighttime mitzvot. Most mitzvot are for the daytime, right? Blowing the shofar, shaking love and etzrog, most of our prayers, wearing the tefillin. A lot of mitzvot are from sunrise to sunset. There are not many mitzvot that are exclusively for nighttime. And yet the night, because nighttime is time to go to sleep, time to rest, time to wind down, prepare for tomorrow. And yet look how many references to nighttime we have when it comes to Pesach. I have a list over here. Number one, the Torah says, Ba'erev tachlu matzot. In the evening, you should eat matzah, nighttime. We stand up and the child stands up on the chair and says, Man ishtana ha-layla hazeh. We call it a lot. Why is this night different from all other nights? We focus on the night. There's the mitzvah to recount the story of Exodus when? Ba'layla, at nighttime. The whole night to start the story of Exodus. Shabbat or other festivals, even though they start at nighttime, but you can always welcome them earlier. Friday afternoon at a certain time, if you want to just bring in Shabbat earlier, add some more Shabbat, you can begin. You can make Kiddush, you can do your prayers, and it's still sun outside. But Pesach, no. You can't begin your Seder, you can't make the first cup of Kiddush until it's dark outside. You cannot add and bring it in earlier. You can only do it at nighttime. When God speaks to Jacob many years earlier, to tell him about the prophecy of his children will be going down to Egypt. When does God appear to Jacob, says the verse in the Torah? He appears to Jacob in a vision at nighttime. And he tells him, don't be afraid to go down to Egypt. I'll be there with you. And the rest of the story of the Jewish people. When God makes the covenant with Avraham, with Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, telling him that your descendants will be in a foreign land and they're going to spend time as slaves in Egypt. When does God appear to Jacob? At nighttime. In fact, he says, look at the stars and see and count the stars. That's how many your descendants are going to be. Again at nighttime. Why is so much about the story of slavery and the story of Pesach centered around the nighttime theme? So the simple answer is because nighttime is a metaphor compared to daytime. Nighttime, when it's dark, it's a time of darkness, confusion, doubt, uncertainty, despair, hopelessness. That's what nighttime presents. Pre-electricity days, when there was no light, everything really was dark. And people, the demons come out at nighttime. People, during the day they function well, but at nighttime they start to have all of these fears and traumas and unable to sleep. A lot of things. People who are not feeling well gets much worse at nighttime. Nighttime is a time that it's the metaphor for exile. Exile, not being in your homeland, not being in your comfortable space, not being in your element, not being in a redeemed state of where you're supposed to be, but being misplaced and being out of your element and being a slave, being somewhere outside of where you should be. That is the metaphor of nighttime. So therefore, the story of slavery in Egypt is all centered around nighttime. However, here is something uniquely Jewish, uniquely part of our belief system. We believe that it's not that there were glorious times in history and dark times in history. The glorious times were during the daytime, and the dark times of persecution and death and war and exile and destruction were the night times of our history. It's much deeper than that. Even during the greatest moments of our night times, of our darkness, destruction, and exiles, something was brewing, something was going on over there. The darkness was a place where the seeds for redemption and the seeds for salvation were being planted in a way that nobody saw necessarily, but it was happening. That's what we believe, that an exile is really a preparatory stage for the redemption. The centuries of torturous slavery in Egypt were not just slavery, but they were also, as the Medrash tells us, as the Talmud tells us, as Hasidic teachings elaborate at great length, they were also conditioning the Jewish people in a way that would prepare them, in a way that would enrich them to eventually arrive at a greater state of redemption and spiritual development. And we therefore see that a lot of the beginnings and the promises of redemption also occur at nighttime. For example, God says, the Torah says, it was midnight when God kills every firstborn in Egypt. God tells the Jewish people to take the lamb and to offer it as a carbon Pesach, a Pesach offering, which, by the way, was sacrilegious in the eyes of the Egyptians because the lamb was their deity, was their God, and that, in essence, was already a refusal, a denial, defiance against the Egyptians. And when should you slaughter this lamb and eat this lamb, which is going to irritate the Egyptians? At nighttime. And then in the prayers we say, what the Torah says, Vayhi b'chatzi halayla, and it was in the middle of the night. That's when the miracles of God happened and the redemption and the exodus from Egypt began to occur. We see that nighttime also began the blessings of redemption. This, for the Jewish people in the end of the first century, beginning of the second century CE, was a state of darkness at nighttime. These rabbis needed to inspire the generation. They needed to pass on a message, to speak to their students, their people, no matter where they were, and tell them, my friends, it's hard, it's difficult right now. Our own people are getting killed and butchered off the streets at all time. How do you offer an uplifting message, a message of hope? How do you tell them this is not permanent? It will change. One day we will regain our sovereignty. One day we'll be a free nation to worship our God and to live in freedom. How do you pass on that message? Where do you get that inspiration from? All the rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Tarfon, they all know that they have to go to Rabbi Akiva's home. It's at Rabbi Akiva's home that they're going to find this message. Almost like some kind of group therapy session, if I may say this, for the rabbis. It's there that we're going to be inspired and we can pass this on to our students. Why Rabbi Akiva's home? They were also very great rabbis. Why he's home? Because we know some things about Rabbi Akiva. What are some of the stories that we know? I'll tell you two of them. One story goes that on one of these delegations to Rome, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, they would, maybe the same one mentioned before, maybe a different one, they were traveling to Rome and they enter and they hear 120 miles outside of the city. They're already hearing the noise, the laughter, the metropolis of Rome is booming, is thriving. Rome is a superpower. And so all the rabbis, aside from Rabbi Akiva, start to cry. And Rabbi Akiva starts to laugh. And they turn to Rabbi Akiva and they say, how could you laugh? And he says, well, why are you crying? What do you mean why we're crying? Rome is the enemy of us, the enemy of God. They destroyed Jerusalem, Israel, the temple, our people. And look how they flourish. Why do the wicked prosper? That's why we cry. And Rabbi Akiva laughed and he said, well, that's why I laugh. Because if those who are the enemies of God enjoy such success in life, how much more so the followers, those committed to God, will enjoy even more success in life. I know one day things will turn around. That's what Rabbi Akiva is thinking about when he's witnessing the glorious success of the Roman metropolis and the Roman Empire. Another time, these rabbis were traveling in Jerusalem and they come to Mount Scopus outside of the center of Jerusalem, and they tear their garments, because that's the custom when you enter Jerusalem and it was in ruins, you tear your garment, like in mourning. And then they enter into the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, and they see a fox is roaming in the place that was the Holy of Holies, the holiest place in the world, where only the high priest would enter once a year and communicate with God. And it's at that moment that the other rabbis begin to cry, and Rabbi Akiva begins to laugh. They say, how could you laugh? Why are you laughing? And he says, well, why are you crying? We're crying because here's a place that the Torah says no one other than the high priest is allowed to enter, not even another priest, not another Levite, not an Israelite. No one can be there. It's the holiest of places. And now we see a fox is roaming around in the ruins. And Rabbi Akiva says, well, now you know why I'm laughing. Because there's one prophecy that tells us about the destruction of Jerusalem. There's a second prophecy that tells us about the rebuilding and the redemption of Jerusalem in ways that the Jews never experienced before. The old and the young will sing and dance in the streets. And so Rabbi Akiva said, until the first one was fulfilled, I was never sure we're going to have the great blessings of the second prophecy. But now that the first one has been fulfilled in its entirety, in its most powerful, destructive way, I know we're going to be blessed with the fulfillment of the prophecy of the rebuilding and the glorious redemption. This is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is the iconic person that no matter what is happening, no matter how dark, no matter how deep it is into the night, he sees the blessings and the seeds of redemption and salvation starting. Rabbi Akiva is a bit like a dreamer. I want to draw your attention to one more text before we conclude. It's in Psachim, page 116b. We know that during the Haggadah prayers at the Seder, we recite Hallel. In fact, we break up the Hallel into two parts. Half the Hallel in the Magit section before the meal, and half the Hallel after the meal. And in a way, there are two themes going on. The Hallel is praising God. So the first half of Hallel, which is before the meal, we're praising God for the exodus from Egypt, historically. The second Hallel, the end of the meal, we're praising God for the future redemption that our prophets tell us about. So in the blessing that concludes Magit, the blessing on the cup of wine, second cup of wine before we go to the meal, what do we say? So let's skip the first paragraph. One concludes this section with Hallel with a blessing that refers to redemption. It's a blessing of redemption. How do you make that blessing? So Rabbi Tarfon says, you raise the cup and you say, thank you, God, who redeemed us and redeemed our forefathers from Egypt. You talk about what this section is dedicated to, the exodus in history from Egypt. Rabbi Akiva adds, you have to add more. No. You have to say, so too the Lord our God and the God of our fathers will bring us to future holidays and festivals in peace, happy over the building of your city and joyous in your service. And there we will eat from the Pesach lamb and other offerings in the future. And blessed are you, Lord, who redeemed Israel and who will redeem Israel. Rabbi Akiva, this is not the section talking about future redemption that happens after the meal. This is talking about past redemptions. Rabbi Akiva says, I can't just live in the past. Even if we have not yet reached future redemptions, even if we're still focusing that we were redeemed, but now we're slaves back again to the Romans, I'm seeing, I'm feeling, I'm dreaming always about future redemptions everywhere. If you're making a blessing about redemption, you have to include the future redemption. Always. Rabbi Akiva saw what others could not see. He saw deep. He did not take things at face value. He didn't see things at the moment, but he saw what they could be and what they will be and what the Torah promises and what the prophets promise and what God promises us. That was Rabbi Akiva. So these rabbis who are living through a very difficult time in Jewish history, they know they must spend Pesach at Rabbi Akiva's home. Not so much for political purposes, for the war purposes, or because they couldn't get home in time, they just came off the ship, because that's who's going to teach them the message of Pesach during those darkest of times. And then the students at dawn, they walk into Rabbi Akiva's room and they say, Rabbis, it's time for the morning Shema. Why did they say it's time for the morning Shema? How many Shmas are there? I mean, there's one at nighttime, but now it's dawn. So obviously, it's now sunrise. Obviously, it's time for the morning Shema. They could have just said, it's time for the Shema. There were two Shemas, a nighttime Shema and a morning Shema. Shema affirms faith in God. There's the affirmation of faith in God at nighttime, when it's dark and scary and confusing and feeling hopelessness. And it's at that time you need to remind yourself, don't worry, Hashem will help us. And then there's morning Shema. Morning is the metaphor when everything is bright and cheery and successful and going according to the plan and we're enjoying the delights of life. There's a different affirmation of faith in God. Thank you. Everything is great. At that time, the Jews were involved with nighttime Shema. How do we strengthen our faith in God when things look so bleak and so dark? But they come to Rabbi Akiva's home. And in Rabbi Akiva's home, you think he spent the whole night nervous about the situation? The Romans are killing us. The Romans are in control. We'll never get out of this. There's no future to the Jewish people. That wasn't the theme, the environment in Rabbi Akiva's home. You walked into Rabbi Akiva's home and you felt uplifted. You felt hopeful. You felt there's a bright future to the Jewish people. You knew that one day we will return back to Israel. And one day there'll be redemption and Mashiach will come and we will be at the temple and we'll offer the Pesach offerings again in the temple. That's the message you felt in Rabbi Akiva's presence. In Rabbi Akiva's presence, even at the darkest moments of history, you could recite the morning Shema, not just nighttime Shema. The morning Shema is one of conviction, one of feeling so determined and feeling so sure that everything will be okay. And so after a whole night of that experience and those discussions and that influence Rabbi Akiva has, the students come in and they say, Rebbe, we're ready to recite the morning Shema. Up until now, even in the mornings, they've been reciting nighttime Shema. Faith out of fear. But now we're ready to have faith out of conviction and faith out of knowing we'll get through this and it's going to be okay. And that was the message of the Seder that year in Rabbi Akiva's home. And that needs to be the message in your home and in my home each Pesach. This year especially. Last year was a very difficult Pesach all over the world. When COVID just hit, and people who have never spent Pesach alone, without their families, parents or children or loved ones, all of a sudden spent Pesach alone. Very challenging Pesach. Who would have imagined then that in a year's time, things will still be not back to normal? Thank God it will be hopefully a little different. Hopefully, some people will be able to gather together. If it's safe, if you've been vaccinated, if you're with family. It's different now than it was a year ago, but it's not the same. Many people will still have a lot of challenges at their Seder. So your Seder will be a time where you're going to reflect. It's still not an easy time. It's a difficult time, and we're praying for health, and we're praying for salvation from this pandemic. But don't just make the Seder about a nighttime Shema. Figure out, whoever you're with, you're alone, you're with loved ones, how to experience a daytime Shema, how to have that assurance, that conviction, that positivity that brings you a person of daylight. It's clear. It's clear that it's going to be okay. It's clear that whatever's happening is in the control of God, and we will follow his footsteps, and we'll follow the signs, and we'll play along, and we'll get out of this. And we'll be reunited with our loved ones. And please God, reunited with Jewish people from all over the world. And reunited once again back in Jerusalem with the rebuilding of the temple, and once again celebrating Pesach as it was in the times of the temple. With Rabbi Akiva, with Rabbi Yeshua, with Rabbi Tafan, with Rabbi Eliezer, with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and with all of the great heroes of Jewish history. So my friends, God bless you. Good luck in your preparations. Use Rabbi Akiva's inspiration to turn your Pesach into something transformational, strengthening your hope, strengthening your faith, and allow your strength to strengthen others as well. Have a good night, and God bless you.